In the early 2000s, a New Yorker named Christian Tarantino was building a near-perfect life for himself. Tarantino was a Long Island native who turned a childhood interest in wrestling and exercise into a gym ownership business, earning himself a small fortune. Tarantino lived in a $1.3 million house in the suburb of Dix Hills, not too far from where he'd grown up and had run the streets with a small crew of mob-connected friends during his teens and early 20s. To the outside world, he was just another small business owner in a city where billions of dollars change hands every day. But like so much in the Big Apple, there was more to Tarantino's life than what appeared at the surface. He harbored the kinds of secrets that would be life-ruining, and he had worked ruthlessly and tirelessly to keep all of this in the past. But one morning in September 2008, everything changed. Over the years, Tarantino had made many enemies, fought many fights, and irked homicide detectives in the most famous and populous city in North America. But in the end, it wasn't the cops, or the streets, or his enemies that led to Tarantino's downfall. It was the men he kept around him since childhood, the ones who knew just enough to orchestrate his downfall, one of whom would come back to haunt Tarantino from beyond the grave. This is The Killer Chronicles. Our story today begins way back on June 23rd, 1994, a day that started like any other for Mid-Island check-cashing employees Julius Baumgart and Walter Tully. The two were armed guards for a cash van, a job that ranges from boring to terrifying. And in the 1990s, such vans were major targets for robbers. They had finished picking up bags of hard-earned cash from a business called Volt Information Systems Incorporated at 6851 Jericho Turnpike in Syosset, New York, when two men with pig masks and a third donning a fake mustache and beard ran up with guns drawn. They ordered Julius and Walter to the ground and began hog-tying the guards so they could make a clean getaway. The mustachioed man was a youngster named Louie Dorval, and he began binding up Julius Baumgart. But while the guard was face down on the pavement with his hands behind his back, Dorval shot him in the back of the head. The robbers panicked and fled with a sack containing $91,600, made it to a getaway vehicle equipped with stolen Florida plates, then drove a short distance where a second getaway car was waiting. They fled to a warehouse elsewhere in New York, where the other robbers began dressing down Louie Dorval. They had planned the robbery carefully, with police scanners, surveillance, hiring a lookout, and wearing suits to blend in with the local stockbrokers. And now everything had been shot to hell. Louie had no explanation. It was a simple accident, likely caused by nerves, but one that would carry grave repercussions to everyone involved. While this type of armed robbery was a deviation from the norm of Louie Dorval's life, he and his pals were no stranger to felonies. Louie had been brought up into a burglary crew months earlier by his buddy Christian Tarantino, whose friends from high school had turned to crime basically from the moment they were able to. Christian had many friends, but two of his best pals were Scott Mulligan and Vincent Gargiulo, the latter of whom was the brother-in-law of the Twisted Sister frontman Dee Snider. Starting as early as 1989, Mulligan, Tarantino, Gargiulo, and others began raking in cash, mostly through burglaries, car thefts, and scams. Their crew was making so much noise in the area that even Gambino crime family descendant John Jr. Gotti tried to get in on the action by attempting to shake them down. While they were not mafia members, they were certainly mob adjacent, with ties to the Lucchese family, as well as looser ties to the Colombos. One of the crew members, a friend of Louie's named Gaetano Guy Furtado, seemed to be on track for a long career in La Cosa Nostra. But it would turn out that 1994 simply wasn't their year. Before the armored van robbery, a group of burglars in a Tarantino crew had knocked down a store called Fellini's Basement in Manhasset and made off with 200 furs, hoping to flip them for a clean $100,000. Louie and Gaetano began shopping around for buyers in New Jersey, but ended up offering them to a confidential informant who was building a case against Lucchese Associates at that time. Their subsequent meetings were recorded, and on August 10, 1994, the federal government unsealed a grand jury indictment charging Louie, Gaetano, and a bunch of Lucchese guys with selling stolen furs and leather coats. Gaetano and Louie learned that they were in trouble 2 days later when the papers wrote about the case. Gaetano's first instinct was to lawyer up and turn himself in. Louie's first impulse was to dye his hair, sell some cocaine he was sitting on, and go on the lam. So while Gaetano was meeting with a lawyer on a place called Fire Island, Louie was getting his coke and fake IDs together to prepare for a life on the run. The two talked one last time over the phone, where Louie explained that he was with Tarantino at the warehouse, and they wanted Gaetano there as well. Tarantino even offered Gaetano a private boat to take him from Fire Island to Long Island. But Gaetano made up his mind. He said his goodbyes and hung up the phone. Then, nothing. His subsequent attempts to contact Louie were unsuccessful. 4 days later, he found out why. On August 16, 1994, an off-duty NYPD officer was trying to have some rest and relaxation on a fishing trip miles off the coast of New York, when he made a grisly discovery. It was a large plastic toolbox, riddled with bullets, but somehow floating on the surface. Inside was the hunched-over body of Louie Dorval, with a bullet hole in the back of his head. How he got there was anyone's guess, but with the recent indictment, there was only one conclusion to draw. Someone was afraid of Louie having loose lips. The case would go unsolved for 6 years, until the feds began investigating a Colombo crew that had been operating on Long Island for much of the 1990s. Its leaders were Saverio Galasso III and Robert Misseri, but they really worked for a made man within the Colombo family. Unlike Tarantino, the Galasso-Misseri investigation focused mostly on white-collar crimes, namely a sophisticated fraud ring that purportedly sold ad space on phone booths, but really diverted the money through shell companies. But during the course of this investigation, the cops in Brookville had arrested 2 brothers named Joseph and Peter Pistone for torturing a dog kennel business. Once in custody, Peter Pistone told the police that he was prepared to offer them a much bigger case if they helped him get off the hook. He wanted to solve the murder of Louie Dorval. What followed was a chilling story, told from the perspective of someone who claimed they had been an eyewitness to a cold-blooded mob hit. Peter Pistone told the authorities that he had been driving in a truck with his brother and Robert Misseri when Joseph Pistone, aka Joe Baldi, shot Dorval in the back of the head without warning. The group loaded his body into a toolbox and boated off the Atlantic coast, shooting the box full of bullets as they dumped it off the side of the yacht. Everything Peter Pistone said lined up with how Louie's body had been discovered. And here was Peter telling on his own brother. Peter claimed the motive had to do with a mafia drug debt owed to a mobster named Sonny Franzese, who told Joe Baldi that he had brought Louie Dorval into their crew and therefore needed to clean up his own mess. Joe Baldi was finally indicted for the murder in the year 2000, based solely on his brother's own proffer statement, and pleaded guilty the following year. But his change of plea hearing was a bumpy ride, where the judge noted that Joseph Pistone seemed to have reservations about the whole thing. The prosecutor, James Miskowitz, also chided Joe Baldi for using the passive voice when describing how Louie had been killed. Specifically that, quote, he was shot in the back of the head, Finally, when the judge asked who shot him, Joseph meekly replied, "I did." That was good enough, and Joseph was given a 20-year sentence. The murder of Louie Dorval had been solved, or so it seemed. But there was one tiny red flag. By then, Peter Pistone had been caught lying and contradicting himself so much that prosecutors revoked his promise for leniency in a letter that otherwise lauded him for solving the Dorval homicide, but also said he'd totally discredited himself, forcing the government to abandon the murder prosecution against Masseri. Despite this, the sentence of Joseph Pistone remained intact. While all of this was going on, Tarantino, Mulligan, and Gargiulo had ventured from the racketeering business into the gym industry, starting up subscription gymnasiums all over Long Island. Gargiulo attempted several times to start his own thing, but consistently ended up going back to his old buddies for money. But there was a nagging element of their past that just wouldn't go away. The feds were pretty sure that Tarantino and Mulligan had something to do with the armored car robbery. For one thing, a Nassau County investigator had spotted Mulligan at a storage unit days after the robbery, and later discovered walkie-talkies, police scanners, and a Mossberg shotgun similar to the one carried by a pig-masked robber stashed there. For another thing, it was common knowledge that the two were tight with Louie Dorval, whose apartment had been cleared of the cocaine, cash, and other items after his murder. But one item remained: a ledger dividing up $91,600 four ways, the precise amount that had been stolen from the armored van drivers. Over the years, the cops had tried to get Tarantino's DNA, and eventually had done so when he was convicted of assault. While the case had languished without arrests, it was nagging at Tarantino that one day the consequences would come. The group had a pact to never discuss business like this with their wives or girlfriends, so Tarantino had instead turned to his trusted confidant, Vinnie Gargiulo. By the early 2000s, Vinnie's life was on a downward spiral. He was mixed up in heroin and cocaine, visibly different to his friends and loved ones, and his businesses were crashing and burning. After a financial falling out, where Mulligan and Tarantino and Vinnie blamed each other for one gym going belly up, Vinnie allegedly snuck onto the property and sold off the equipment in secret. The two others never spoke to him again, but their long-standing friendship had prevented the conflict from escalating further. But then came the afternoon of August 18th, 2003. Vinnie was standing on West 30th Street and Broadway when he was approached by a young man he knew from the gym industry, Justin Bressman. The two shook hands, and then Justin simply pulled out a pistol and shot Vinnie dead. The brazen daytime murder was quickly solved, and the cops pulled Justin in for questioning, but let him go after a lawyer named Melvin Roth intervened. Before they got to effect an arrest, Justin Bressman seemingly disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing but a burnt car behind. What few knew at that time was that just 3 months before his death, Vinnie had met in secret with an FBI agent and offered to give up information that would solve the murders, namely the 1994 killings of Louie Dorval and Julius Baumgart. The offer was delivered to the FBI via an anonymous note, but the feds soon figured out Vinnie was behind it. But Vinnie wasn't doing this for altruistic reasons. He wanted the FBI to pay him $500,000, and at the same time was attempting to blackmail both Mulligan and Tarantino, threatening them in voicemails with the phrase, quote, "When you see what I have on you, you'll be sorry." The FBI had told Vinnie that they don't operate like a pawn shop and sent him on his way, and his attempts at blackmail had not worked either. Now, whatever secrets Vinnie Gargiulo had been holding on to all these years appeared to have died with him. But a secret envelope addressed to the NYPD the following year changed everything. The package simply contained a note and a tape. Its sender was unknown, but the information on the tape was damning. The NYPD sent it off to the FBI, who verified that it was the real deal. It contained the voices of Vinnie Gargiulo and Christian Tarantino discussing not just the murder of Louie Dorval, but the fact that the investigation of Julius Baumgart's murder simply wouldn't go away. Apparently, amid growing tension in their friendship, or with the desire to one day use it for blackmail, Vinnie had gone to Tarantino's home with a secret recording device in his pocket. The following is recreated portions of the conversations based on the transcripts. On the armored van robbery.
I had the car, remember? The other half of the car we pulled up in. We changed tails over here, and we went to a different car and took off.
The bombshell from the Louie Dorval murder came when Vinnie asked Tarantino about how Scott Mulligan had accidentally dropped a large chunk of concrete on Tarantino's thumb as they were weighing down the toolbox, forcing Tarantino to go to the hospital later.
What about, remember the trunk and your finger, your thumb? You told me something like you smashed your thumb or you squished your finger.
Yeah.
There was no skin on that, right?
Buddy, no fucking way. I was out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the body was found floating up 2 days later or better. There was one piece of skin on a fucking rock. No way.
On the Peter Pistone fallout.
This guy, Pistone, okay, running around telling everybody he bumped Louie. He got popped in Brooklyn.
Unbelievable.
Him and this guy, Pistone, and like 5 other half-mozzarellas got arrested for like some RICO kind of thing or something. You know what I mean? Out on the island, all right? They all had their DNA taken too.
Even with these tapes in hand, it would be 4 more years before the feds pulled together enough to indict Christian Tarantino on 3 murder charges, hitting him with the killings of Julius Baumgart, Louie Dorval, and Vinnie Gargiulo. And just like he had in the Colombo case of 2000, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Miskowitz took the reins of this prosecution, relying on a theory that Tarantino and others had lured Louie to their warehouse, possibly under the guise of buying his cocaine, shot him in the head, and dumped the body in a yacht owned by a man named Craig Miller, while cohorts painted and cleaned up the warehouse. If you're keeping track, that's 2 separate indictments, both arranged by the same U.S. attorney, each alleging 2 mutually exclusive theories behind the murder of Louie Dorval. For his part, Joseph Pistone did his best to compete with his brother's erratic nature, giving multiple conflicting statements to the FBI. He confessed to the murder in 2006, claiming it was on the order of both Tarantino and Sonny Franzese, then walked back his statement in 2008, alleging that Guy Furtado killed Louie because he, quote, slapped his girlfriend Janice around. And yet, after the Tarantino indictment, Joseph Pistone remained behind bars with years left on his sentence. Tarantino took his case to trial, arguing that the witnesses against him were liars and that the case was a train running on the rails of government corruption. By that point in time, his old buddy, Gaetano Furtado, had become a notorious mafia informant who was telling on the Colombo family, but also dropped in to give testimony in Tarantino's case. The defense lambasted him as a liar, but Vinnie Gargiulo's tapes were a harder burden to overcome. The result was a split, where Tarantino was convicted of Louie's murder and the armored van robbery, but jurors hung on the Vinnie Gargiulo counts. With Tarantino headed for a second trial, the government played the one remaining card that was left for them. They went down to Florida, where Scott Mulligan had moved with his wife, and raided their Palm Beach County home with a squad of machine gun-toting FBI agents. Mulligan was charged with the murder of Julius Baumgart, based on evidence that he served as a lookout in a secondary car, while Tarantino, Dorval, and a third man committed the actual robbery. With a life sentence in his future, Mulligan decided he would turn his back on his lifelong friend and started talking. Mulligan took the stand and told everything. He spoke about their time together in high school, how they became burglars, then robbers, then murderers. He discussed the stolen furs, how they'd learned about, quote, lackadaisical and elderly, end quote, armored vanguards who would make for an easy robbery target. How he panicked when he heard on the police scanner that Baumgart was killed, and how Dorval told the others that he had, quote, made a mistake, end quote, when they demanded to know what happened. He talked about how it wasn't too long after that day that he was helping to dispose of Louie's body, and that they all knew from the day that the botched robbery happened that Louie's time had come. On top of Mulligan's testimony, the feds could establish that Justin Bressman had worked for Tarantino and hired a lookout for Vinnie's murder, stating that his boss at the Synergy Gym, quote, Maddie Roth, was paying him $35,000 for the hit. Maddie Roth was widely believed to be a fake name cover for Tarantino. Mulligan's testimony sealed the deal. Tarantino was convicted in 2012 of conspiracy to kill Vinnie, but acquitted of the actual murder. But what of Justin Bressman? While he is widely believed to have been murdered, he's still officially listed as a missing person, and police haven't officially ruled out the possibility that he faked his own death and went into hiding. Lastly, Scott Mulligan implicated a man named Robert Smith as a cohort in the Julius Baumgart murder. But Smith was never prosecuted, and we weren't able to dig up much on him. As for Joseph Pistone, his lawyers raised the issue of the obvious conflicting indictments as early as 2009, but ultimately, nothing happened. He was released from prison in 2019. Tarantino's sentencing came in 2013. It was a rowdy, contentious hearing, with the prosecution calling the defendant's supporters full of, quote, garbage, and Vinnie Gargiulo and Julius Baumgart's family members telling Tarantino he deserved to suffer for what he did. Dee Snider showed up with family members to support them, telling reporters outside he was still deeply affected by his brother-in-law's death. At the end of it all, it was Tarantino's turn to speak. By this point in his life, he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, slowly becoming a prisoner in his own body.
You know, as far as I hear a lot of people talking today, talking about how I should suffer and all of that, you can count on that. I am. I'm suffering, Your Honor. My body is being eaten from the inside out. I feel terrible about what happened to all the families, Your Honor, despite the fact that I maintain my innocence. When Scott Mulligan comes into the courtroom and lies through his teeth and creates another story about how him and I plotted together to kill Louie Dorval, but he's not charged with murder, wait until Scott gets his. You know, Vinnie was my friend, and despite what happened, I didn't kill that guy. I didn't have nothing to do with it. Vinnie had a lot of enemies, Judge, and I know Vinnie wasn't this great guy that his family is making it out to be. And then Your Honor, you have these two crackheads who get together and kill him, and somehow the prosecutor, Miskowitz, is trying to convince everybody, and he hoodwinks this courtroom, Your Honor, that I'm Manny Roth. I never called Manny Roth a day in my life. I don't know. I'm truly sorry for the families for any pain they incurred, but I'm going through my own personal hell, Your Honor, which will make you all happy. And with that, that's what I have to say.
Then the judge sentenced him to life.